Right now, something is happening in the Middle East that should stop you. Cold wars are breaking out. Alliances are shifting overnight. Nations that have been enemies for decades are suddenly joining forces. And the world's most powerful military leaders are being drawn into a region that most of them would rather avoid. Turn on any news channel, open any newspaper, scroll through any social media feed. The headlines are screaming at you, but here's what those headlines aren't telling you. Here's what the news anchors aren't saying. Here's what the political analysts, with all their fancy degrees and expensive suits, are completely missing. Every single thing you're watching unfold in the Middle East right now was written down centuries ago, not predicted by a politician, not forecasted by an algorithm, not calculated by some think tank in Washington, D.C., written down in a book thousands of years old, and the level of detail is so specific, so precise, so eerily accurate that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I'm not here to scare you. I'm not here to sell you on religion. I'm here to show you something that the rational, thinking part of your brain needs to wrestle with. Because whether you're a believer or a complete skeptic, the evidence sitting in front of us right now deserves serious attention. So stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see every news story for the rest of your life. Here's what most people are doing wrong. Most people are watching the chaos in the Middle East the same way they watch a reality TV show. They're focused on the drama. They're reacting to the emotion. They're picking sides based on what their favorite news anchor tells them to think. And every day they wake up confused, anxious, overwhelmed. Because the events keep changing. The alliances keep shifting. The violence keeps escalating. And nothing seems to make sense. There's a reason for that. When you try to understand a puzzle, without having the box, without seeing the picture on the cover, every individual piece looks random and meaningless. You pick up one piece, you stare at it, it means nothing. You pick up another. Still nothing. You try to connect two pieces. They don't fit. So you force them together and create a picture in your mind that looks completely different from what the puzzle actually shows. That's exactly what most people are doing with the Middle East. They're watching individual events, a missile strike here, a ceasefire there, a new military alliance forming somewhere else, and they're trying to make sense of it with a framework that is fundamentally incomplete. The politicians have an incomplete framework. The media has an incomplete framework. Most historians have an incomplete framework. And the result is confusion, fear, and a feeling that the world is completely out of control. But here's the thing. The world is not out of control. At least not in the way most people think. There is a pattern, there is a sequence, there is a roadmap, and that roadmap was written down long before any of us were born. The problem isn't that people are stupid. The problem is that they're looking at the Middle East through the wrong lens entirely. They're using a political lens, they're using an economic lens, they're using a military strategy lens. But almost nobody, at least in mainstream conversation, is looking through the lens that actually fits. The prophetic lens, the biblical lens. And here's where it gets interesting, because when you look at what's happening right now through that lens, everything suddenly clicks into place. The confusion disappears. The random events start connecting. The pieces of the puzzle stop looking random and start forming a picture that is both stunning and sobering. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Let's talk about what the Bible actually says. And I want to be clear here. I'm not going to cherry-pick vague verses and stretch them to fit modern events. That's what conspiracy theorists do. That's intellectual dishonesty. What I'm going to do is show you the specific, concrete, verifiable predictions that were written down thousands of years ago, and compare them, side by side, with what is happening on the ground in the Middle East right now. You can fact-check everything I'm about to say. You can look up every reference, you can verify every historical claim, because the truth doesn't need to hide. Let's start at the beginning. The return of Israel. In 1948, something happened that the entire world of geopolitical analysts said was impossible. A people group that had been scattered across the globe for nearly 2,000 years, without a homeland, without a government, without a military, came back together and established a nation. Not just any nation. The exact nation they had been driven out of, in the exact geographic location they had been driven from, speaking the exact same language that had been considered dead for centuries. Israel was reborn. Now here's what's remarkable. This wasn't just a historical event. This was a prophetic event. The book of Ezekiel, written approximately 2,600 years ago, described this exact scenario. Ezekiel chapter 36 and 37 describe the Jewish people being gathered from all the nations where they had been scattered and brought back to their homeland. Ezekiel 36:24 says, "For I will take you from among the nations, gather you out of all countries, and bring you into your own land." Then, in chapter 37, Ezekiel has a vision of a valley of dry bones, representing a dead nation, coming back to life. The bones come together. Flesh and muscle appear. Breath enters the body. The dead nation lives again. Scholars, historians, and theologians have connected this passage to the rebirth of Israel for centuries. And in 1948, it happened. In modern history, with cameras recording, with newspapers documenting, with the United Nations voting to recognize it. But that's just the beginning. Jerusalem, the focal point of global conflict. The Bible also predicted something else. It predicted that Jerusalem would become what it calls a burdensome stone for all nations. Zechariah 12:3, written over 2,500 years ago, says, "And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it." Think about that for a second. Think about what you see every single time you turn on the news. What city is at the center of every conflict? What city is the most contested piece of real estate on the entire planet? What city do 3 of the world's major religions claim as sacred? What city causes more diplomatic tension, more international debate, more United Nations resolutions than any other city on Earth? Jerusalem. A city with a population smaller than many mid-sized American cities. A city that controls no major oil reserves. A city that has no strategic harbor. A city that, from a pure military or economic standpoint, should be relatively insignificant on the world stage. And yet, every major superpower is obsessed with it. Every peace negotiation circles back to it. Every religious conflict in the region connects to it. Just as the Bible said. The nations aligning against Israel. Let's get more specific, because this is where it gets really interesting. The book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, describes a massive military coalition that will gather against Israel in what the text calls the latter days. This prophecy describes a specific alliance of nations that will come against Israel, and it describes them in ways that biblical scholars have been mapping to modern geography for decades. The text mentions several key players. It mentions a nation to the far north of Israel, identified by biblical geographers as corresponding to modern Russia. It mentions Persia, which is the ancient name for what we today call Iran. It mentions Libya. It mentions what corresponds to Ethiopia or Sudan. It mentions what some scholars identify as Turkey. Now hold on, step back for a moment, look at the news today. Russia has deep military involvement in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, which sits directly to the north of Israel. Iran, ancient Persia, is openly funding and arming proxy groups whose stated goal is the destruction of Israel. Iran is funding Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran is funding Hamas in Gaza. Iran is funding the Houthis in Yemen. Iran's leadership publicly calls for Israel to be wiped off the map. Turkey, under its current leadership, has taken an increasingly adversarial position toward Israel and has been strengthening ties with Iran and Russia. Libya remains a destabilized state where radical factions operate freely. Sudan has had its own complex relationships with radical groups and geopolitical tensions. The alliance that Ezekiel described 2,600 years ago looks remarkably like the alliance we're watching form in real time on our television screens today. This is not a vague prophecy. This is not "the stars will darken and the winds will shift." These are specific nations, in specific geographic relationships to Israel, forming a specific kind of coalition. And we're watching it happen. The Abraham Accords and what comes next. Here's something else worth noting. In the book of Daniel and in other prophetic books, there's a pattern described where certain Arab nations will not participate in the coalition against Israel. There's a group mentioned that seems to observe rather than engage. Some scholars have noticed that certain Gulf states, nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, have been moving toward normalization with Israel through agreements like the Abraham Accords. These nations have been taking a different path from Iran, Turkey, and Russia. They've been choosing economic integration and security cooperation with Israel rather than military confrontation. Now, whether that continues or shifts, and recent events suggest massive pressure on that stability. But the pattern itself is consistent with what the ancient texts describe. Nations that were ancient enemies of Israel are making peace, while a different coalition of nations is aligning for confrontation. It's happening simultaneously, just as the texts describe. The war that changes everything. Here's where we need to slow down and pay very careful attention. Because the Bible doesn't just describe the formation of this coalition. It describes what happens when this coalition moves against Israel. Ezekiel 38 and 39 describe a massive military campaign. It describes this coalition as coming against Israel like a storm, like a cloud that covers the land. And then something remarkable happens. The text describes a divine intervention, a series of catastrophic events, earthquakes, fire, massive confusion, disease, that turn back the coalition. Now here's what's important to understand. I'm not here to tell you exactly how to interpret every detail of this prophecy. There are serious biblical scholars who disagree on the timing, the sequence, and the specific meaning of every verse. But here's what almost all of them agree on. The general framework, a massive coalition forming against Israel in the latter days, involving nations from the north and east, with world powers involved, has never been more literally fulfilled than it is right now.